Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Disappearances video. I'm glad to be back to do these. Probably end up doing maybe about another 2 or 3, and then I'll wrap up this series and start focusing on another new series for you as well. This one actually just has to do with an entry that I found that ties in to a video I did a couple of months back. That was with regards to the disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater. And so the reason I wanted to do this one is because this guy who also disappeared was also a very prominent politician, and the way his circumstances, the way he ended up disappearing, kind of mimics essentially everything that I was mentioning in the last video. So when I was reviewing the info, I thought to myself, I'm going to go ahead and share this one with everyone out there. But yes, to this day, his disappearance remains a complete mystery. There has only been one, absolutely just one theory as to what may have happened to him, and even then, that information is very loose. There's very few tidbits that can be tied back to it, and it has to do with this. You're looking at him now. It's the disappearance of John Lansing Jr. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the information associated with his life and then ultimately his mysterious disappearance. So who was this John Lansing Jr.? Well, actually, when reviewing his information, he was pretty much a mid-prominent politician during the rise of American politics. When I was reading his info, it was interesting to find out he was basically in there, like making a lot of important decisions or being in circumstances that could impact very important matters. His name has essentially been lost throughout American political history, but he was still someone that was there. Just wasn't a nobody. He just happened to be, I guess, usurped by other more prominent names. And it's not just him. It seems like a lot of other people within his family were also pretty prominent in the field of politics. He was born on January 30th, 1754, to be specific. His younger brother ended up becoming a New York State treasurer. He was also the uncle of someone else who essentially became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And through one of his other brothers, he became another uncle, in this case for a New York State senator, and then eventually the grandfather of someone who had become a U.S. Secretary of State. So lots of prominent people in the field of politics there with the last name Lansing. And so that was interesting to find that out too, almost like the Kennedys or others that just continue to build that somewhat dynasty in the world of politics. He himself, he eventually just studied law there at school, graduated, and then was able to become a member, I guess this was his first thing, of the New York State Assembly, and then eventually becoming its speaker, and then eventually becoming a member of what was known as the Confederation Congress. All of this back in the late 1700s, around the 1780s to be specific. Even at one point, this guy John Lansing Jr. was even mayor of Albany, and he was able to represent New York there in the Constitutional Convention. What was interesting to find out, though, was that he was very much so against the Federalist Papers. These were the ones that were ratified or there by Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, James Madison. He was strongly opposed to them, and he was part of a group called the Anti-Federalists. He was absolutely just opposed to the notion of a centralized, very strong national government. He just wanted to keep the Articles of Confederations, but to amend them, I guess, to have less power to the national government. So he joined other prominent politicians to try to work to oppose it, and interestingly enough, to oppose the at their time the recently introduced United States Constitution. Only reason was because he thought that it was flawed and that it's something that could be worked on afterward. But no, he opposed it, and whenever it was eventually instituted, his signature along with several others was purposely left out. Like either I was trying to see if maybe he chose to not sign it, or if he was told basically you're not signing this. Either way though, if he wasn't opposed to it, his name would have been on the Constitution. Interesting to find that out. That's the kind of influence that he somewhat had this guy John Lansing Jr. To know that eventually just his name could have been on in history in terms of the Constitution itself. Even then, though, afterward, he eventually became a justice of the New York State Supreme Court. This was in 1790. He stayed there for a good while, and then eventually he was elevated to the post of Chief Justice in 1798. And then it seemed like he just continued doing that, eventually becoming a Chancellor of New York, and then also a regent from the university. I guess in that time period, he was more of in a teaching phase, like I've seen several other prominent politicians end up doing. But cut to a couple of years after that. So again, this is a guy who basically his entire life was in the world of politics. He was making a lot of friends and he was making a lot of enemies, again because of his opposing stance to many prominent politicians. And so cut to a couple of years later, on December 12th, 1829 to be specific, he was there at a Manhattan hotel, staying, I guess, for some kind of business, when he's told either someone's else there or he was seen, either way, leaving the hotel with the intention of mailing a letter at a nearby dock. Nothing was out of the ordinary. It just was him leaving the hotel and then supposedly to come back thereafter mailing the letter. Unfortunately, though, he was basically never seen again. Wherever he went, in terms of that dock, or wherever he went to try to mail that letter, he was just basically gone. Nobody ever saw him again. Obviously, inquiries were made as to what was happening. Where was his body? Where was he last seen? Did anyone have anything in terms of any kind of clues? Nope. It's like he just basically went out of that hotel. Some people saw him, and then that was it. They never, ever, ever saw him again. And so, lots of theories that came about afterward in terms of his disappearance. He was an older gentleman, but not that old. I mean, he was still, it seems like at that point, someone that was, of good mental capacity. He wasn't senile. He just wasn't in a position where he would just be outright disappearing like that. So people were presuming a lot of things. There was a notion that maybe that area that he was at by the dock, that he drowned. And the way I was picturing it was, imagine him going by the water after mailing the letter and then just peering over, and then just by pure happen chance, a gust of wind or him slipping, maybe he fell into the water and then he was never able to get out afterward. Others, the more common theory, is the fact that he was murdered. This ties into something else I'll talk about here in a minute. And this is because, again, throughout his entire life, he was there making a lot of enemies, or he just was murdered just for his possessions, just for his money. Whatever was the case, it could happen. It happens every day in America where people are robbed and then someone is killed by the robber to make sure that there's no evidence afterward. But unfortunately, there's nothing that ties into that, because no one has come forward stating, that they killed him, or nor no one has like any evidence from the police or anything like that in terms of him being an unfortunate victim of a robbery turned murder or something along those lines. The only theory, and this was what I was mentioning earlier, the only theory, the only clue that leads to this guy John Lansing Jr.'s disappearance has to do with this. It ties into this guy, a guy by the name of Thurlow Weed. He was someone who was a former Republican political leader there in New York. In 1882, he had his memoirs. It looks like he had written them for a good while and then eventually either kept them on the side, like never really published them, or decided to do so. Either way, they were published by his own grandson, a guy by the name of T.W. Barnes. And what was revolutionary about this particular set of memoirs was the fact that there was this passage. Within it, this guy, Thurlow Weed, stated that he was told by others that John Lansing Jr. was murdered by several prominent political and then social figures. And the reason why he was murdered was because he was always in the way of their own interest or their own projects. It kind of ties into what I was mentioning earlier, no? In terms of him making enemies, especially of some very important people. So whatever his cause was, however righteous he thought it was still getting in the way of some of these other people. And so once that happened, it seemed like they, in turn, took things into their own hands. The only source, again, is this one single memoirs from this guy, Thurlow Weed. And even then, he did not say who gave him that information. That source remained completely anonymous, and that's because that source told this guy Thurlow Weed not to publish this information ever until all the guilty parties had died out. And it turns out eventually that they did die out, just I guess from old age or whatever was the case. But Thurlow Weed still decided not to do anything about publishing them. It was only after his grandson, again T.W. Barnes, did it that this information became prominent. So still no named sources within the memoir, and even then all the parties, whoever they were, presumably they're all dead, so nothing in terms of getting more info. So that just remains very loose as well in terms of the disappearance of John Lansing Jr. But in a way, it makes sense when you have a guy like this who's pretty prominent in the world of politics, who ends up making very bad enemies. It just seems like that would be plausible. Like it's not out of the realm for him to be walking, let's say, towards some corner there, towards the drop box for his letter, and then facing someone there waiting for him, waiting by the side, and then that was it. They were gone afterward. But yes, his body was never recovered. Nobody knows still what occurred. I guess it's still an open case. I don't know how the things work there in New York, but who knows? Maybe it's still something that's being investigated. Not likely. But either way, though, his legacy continues. There was a town, Lansing, that was named after him, and then another town also named Lansing was named by settlers of that original town. So even to this day, it seems like that he has his own legacy there within those cities. But that's it. That's all the information associated with the disappearance of this politician, John Lansing Jr. If anyone has any more info, anything else I might have missed, please post those comments below. I'll also include the link for that judge, the disappearance of Joseph Force Crater as well, if you're interested in that, in a similar type video too. So, alright everybody, thanks again as always. Take care.